Compliance is a profession where people work tirelessly to make the world a better place. And there are hundreds of amazing and inspiring women who have helped the field develop into what it is today. Great Women in Compliance is part of the Compliance Podcast Network, so join Mary, Shirley, and Lisa Fine as they talk with women in compliance who are making a difference.
Welcome to the Great Women in Compliance podcast with Lisa Fine and Mary Shirley. I'm Mary, and today our guest is Nicole Diaz, who is the Global Head of Integrity and Compliance within Snap's legal department. Welcome, Nicole. Please tell us about your background and how you got to where you are today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Pleasure.
So my background, I was a litigator for a decade, doing both white-collar matters and complex civil. And that's actually how I came to Snap. I started in our litigation team. Mm-hmm. And the role opened up to do compliance work, which I had already sort of been doing, on a partial basis. But I really wanted to go full-time into compliance because I felt that was an opportunity to fix a lot of the problems that I saw as a litigator.
Right. Mm-hmm.
As a litigator, you realize it's not about no one, even in the white collar matters, these aren't bad people. They don't usually think that they're committing a crime when they're doing it. Complex civil, right, is similar. It's everyone thinks that they're sort of in the right. And what really is at the root of these problems is very human dynamics, where people, and the perfect storm of unclear policies, right? Unclear regulations, gray area. And so I really wanted to be part of helping build a really strong and ethical company culture that, help people develop ethical awareness at work, operate in a manner with their team members that help people spot issues and make the right decisions, and then give them the structure and the framework that they needed to do their job well.
Excellent. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more about the ethical practices there. And I think that's a part of some of the ethics and compliance issues that you deal with in technology, social media companies. I'd love to hear about some of perhaps the special things that you need to work on in your area of risk. And how does that fit in with your ethical leadership model?
Sure. So it's interesting. You're framing the question in terms of risk. And at some level, I think many of the risks are the same, right? You're still going to be dealing with bribery and corruption, trade law. Of course, privacy is a huge one. My team doesn't handle that directly, so I won't be speaking as much on that. But it's not, the risks are the same. I would say, of course, the profile is different at a tech company. And I also think, in some sense, the opportunities are greater. And I feel like the tech industry has changed our understanding of what it even means to practice corporate ethics. Because what you have in the tech industry is you have an employee population of really dialed in team members who have, they are not working factory hours and, really, and focused on sort of survivor level issues, right? They generally are a well-paid population, generally well-educated. And so, that when they're thinking about corporate ethics, they're really thinking about these higher order issues of, are we doing the right thing as a company? What's our impact on the world? Is this a place that is in line with my values? And then you fuel that also with the enormous responsibility of tech, right? We have, I think in the beginning of the tech industry is a little bit like the golden promise, right? This is tech just makes your life better. And what we've really seen in the last few years is a recognition of the potential harm and responsibility that tech has to think really carefully about even the unintended negative consequences that it can have in the world. And so to my mind, I always think about corporate ethics as a two-way street, right? There is sort of the traditional area of compliance, which is ensuring that team members through their individual actions are protecting the company, operating on the right side of the road. But you also see the second side of the street, right? Which is the organizational ethics. And can team members trust that the company has its organizational ethics really on a really firm foundation? And, it's not enough anymore as a company for leaders to say, we don't violate the law. And for that to be the business integrity messaging, they really have to come out in front and address the social responsibility of the company, and find ways to, I think, empower their team members, to view that kind of conscience and that caring of their team members as a real asset of the company. And think about, well, how do we take advantage of that asset? How do we really engage and empower our team members, not just as followers of rules, but as ethical leaders? How does that make us a better company?
And so thinking about that, for me, when I hear what you're saying, a lot of that comes more into the culture and value side of things versus the specific, tangible framework, I would say, of compliance. Is there anything in particular that you're doing that you'd like to share with us in terms of getting those individuals to have integrity embedded into the DNA of the business, people intuitively just doing the right thing rather than thinking about, am I complying with this policy?
Yeah. So I will say the first step of that journey is really tying your ethics and compliance efforts into the values of the company. There's that, diagram that shows it's like an iceberg, and the deepest level of behavioral change is identity, right? So if you just throw a bunch of rules at people, it doesn't really sink in. And so you want to create an ethical framework that's rooted in who are we, as a company. And at Snap, I have the benefit of being able to leverage our amazing value of kindness. So last year we revamped our code of conduct to be the guide to kind business. And this idea of kind business is built up around the encompassing, again, not just of, not violating the law, not committing misconduct, but also ESG principles, that idea of, corporate responsibility, positive social impact. And so when you put those two halves together, you have a kind business. And the idea is to really empower our people to think of themselves as kind business leaders and what that means within the scope of their particular role. And so the next year will be sort of continuing to leverage those concepts. We're developing a champions program. We are, doing some messaging with senior business leaders. We're revamping our basic training, all to continue to leverage that message of kind business.
Oh, wonderful. Well, this is very fortuitous because I was hoping to talk to you about your shiny new code of conduct, and you've already mentioned it. And I hadn't made the link between that and affecting culture. So what I was going to ask you was what one I wanted to point out. I thought it was awesome, your new code of conduct. The very first thing you notice is superficial, but I think it's important when it comes to people being able to digest and the document being approachable, is that it's visually very appealing. There's not too much text running all over the place. It's easy on the eye. And then the next thing that jumped out at me when it came to reading it was the kindness evangelism piece. And I love that because from a personal values perspective, that is something that I truly prize, but it is, I think, relatively rare to see it prized in the commercial space. And so to see this being embedded in your code of conduct and in fact being a pillar of the document itself, now based on what you've just said, essentially, if I understand you correctly, you're saying that when our people are identifying with themselves as being kind, they're naturally going to act in such a way that facilitates that kind of treatment towards our stakeholders, ourselves, and our environment. And therefore, it reminds me of a quote that I love, which is, give someone a reputation to live up to and watch them shine. So you're essentially saying we are a company of kind people. And through that, there is that understanding and expectation that if I'm an employee of a company as such, I need to be kind and ethical and virtuous.
Yeah. And a couple things on that. One was that to me, the value of kind works so well because it's a relational quality,
right?
Right? It's not a sort of virtue, right? Like the virtue approach to ethics is sort of like, here are my personal standards for myself, right? And you sort of do things because you hold yourself to a certain, I'm an honest person, I'm this, whatever. Kind, actually, I love, it gets you to think about your impact on others.
Right.
So it already has that way to kind of put your attention on what will be the ripple effect of my action in the world. The other thing is, in thinking about how to put together the code of conduct, I also studied a lot of the field of ESG, environmental social governance, which has become quite clear now is sort of the, getting everyone to really rethink how we approach compliance work. And what I loved about ESG was the ties it had towards stakeholder capitalism, because I think ESG is the output, right? Like your KPIs on ESG, all of that is wonderful, the reporting out. But to me, the real impact of ESG is the input. It's the mental map that it has for how to think about business, shifting us from a shareholder primacy model, which is just focused on maximizing short-term profit for shareholders, and expanding that towards a long-term view of business, which says actually the most successful way to think about business is to expand your time horizon towards the long term and to really think about how do you invest in the health of everyone with whom you come into contact with. So it's kind of, it's kind of moving from what's been called like a fishing with dynamite model. Like if you fish with dynamite, great, you're going to get a lot of fish very quick, but you're going to kill the pond, right? And so even the shareholders might say, great, that was wonderful, but that's going to implode for you. And, there's certainly models of that out in the world where businesses who have an extractive approach to business can be very successful in the short term, but they might face regulatory hurdles down the road. They might lose the trust of their users, of their business partners. And so a better way to think about business that is offered, I learned about through ESG and the stakeholder model of capitalism is to really think about investing in the health of all of your stakeholders. And to be very clear about who are those stakeholders and to understand, to think, okay, well, I'm actually doing this, right? The being kind isn't even so much like I'm now going to think of myself as a good person or a caring person. It's actually a business strategy. And the business strategy is I recognize that my long-term health is tied up with the long-term health of all my stakeholders. So I'm going to take measures to proactively invest in the health of those stakeholders, right? And of course, one of those measures is by following rules, right? Making sure you don't enter an emerging market and support corruption in that market, right? Through condoning bribery would be one example. But I think what the stakeholder model really does is says, well, is that enough? What else can we do? And so it brings this element of innovation into the world of ethics and a way to think about ethics that really says, well, this isn't even a constraint on business, right? Like our ethics, our reputation, our investment in our stakeholders is actually our road to profit. It is very consistent, aligned, and embedded in our business strategy.
Wonderful. Well, I'm glad you headed into the direction of ESG because I was going to ask you about that as well. So as I understand it, ESG strategy is not owned by compliance at Snap, but you do work cross-functionally with other teams to facilitate the company's ESG goals. How does this work in practice? Who does what?
Yeah, it's wonderful. Our ESG lead is part of the same team that I am. We're peers at Snap. She's wonderful. And it's been a real, I think it makes absolute sense to have the ESG function be part of the compliance function. Because I think that there's benefit on both sides. On the ESG side, I think ethics and compliance can assist ESG by really taking what I just said, their whole model of how they think about business, and building that into our ethical culture programming, so that you're getting people to have an ESG mindset, not just let's get some output and then report it to get our ratings up. Right. So it's really embedded into the culture of the company. And then I think, there's also certainly the compliance crossover, right, where there's certain elements of ESG that are just simply very compliance and operationally focused that we can assist with in that way. Because we're part of the same team, we interact all the time. One of the major things that I did with her that was really helpful was to participate in a materiality assessment. So, in the compliance world, we typically do risk assessments. Again, is sort of focused on the mitigating risk aspect of the, compliance pie. But this was the other half of the pie, the ethical leadership, social impact and pie. And in that arena, the question is not let's assess risk. It's let's find out what we care about and what's important to our stakeholders. So you kind of get at some of those reputational aspects and some of those, higher order ethical questions, right? We're not at risk if we don't do this necessarily, but we feel it's important to our overall ethical reputation as a company and who we want to be in the world. And so that was it was a wonderful chance to hear senior leaders speaking on that aspect of our corporate ethics.
That is interesting. I'm probably going to put you on the spot right now, so no worries if there isn't an answer to this. But was there anything sort of surprising that you learned from doing that assessment?
Yeah. I think it wasn't surprising, but it was notable, was the consistency of thought. Because in some sense, when you start to talk about ethics, it can get into abstraction very quickly, right? And it can kind of have that virtue model, like we're good people, we do the right thing. Sometimes it can feel like there's not a lot of substance. If all you're saying is we don't violate the law, okay. It was what I saw in these interviews was a real consistency of thought in terms of how that sort of long-term thinking I just talked about, that sort of ethical business strategy actually really guided the decision-making of our leaders and in very tangible ways, such that after having done a few of those interviews, I was really impressed with how consistent everyone was and the way that they really thought about their jobs and how deeply that value really impacted their approach.
Awesome. Thank you for that. You're also a big proponent of DEI, which has been falling sometimes officially under the compliance portfolio for some companies. Other times, some of us are taking an interest in it. So, for example, I'm on the committee of our AAPI employee resource group, and it's manifested in I'm sure, countless ways for those of us who are interested, but perhaps it's not official as part of our job. So I'd like to hear from you. How has your being a proponent of DEI impacted your approach to ethics and compliance?
Great. Yes, I'm half Mexican, born in Mexico, half Jewish. My mom met my dad on spring break in Mexico. And I spent my whole childhood kind of, all of my dad's family was still in Mexico. So I spent my whole childhood, my whole growing up with this kind of like a, camera one, camera two, like a very good bi-ethnic, cultural upbringing. And I feel like that deeply impacted my view of the world and how I relate to groups, how I think of myself, what it felt like for me to go to law school. It's really like very embedded in who I am as a person. And so it became part of my personal professional journey. But I love that it's now become also very core to my work as an ethics and compliance person, because I don't think you can have an ethical culture if you don't have DEI. And I say that for a couple of reasons. The the main one is simply like, if you have a homogeneous culture where everyone thinks alike, you are absolutely going to be more prone to moral blind spots. You're just not going to spot them. And there's this amazing book by Max Bazerman called Blind Spots that, talks about how blind spots exist and like how prevalent they can be. It's like a really fascinating read. I love how he talked about one anecdote from there is there's a guy who was working at Ford making the Pinto. And he's like, he said, before I worked at Ford, I could have told you the Pinto was a horrible idea. And after I worked at Ford, I could have told you the Pinto was a horrible idea. But while I was at Ford, I didn't see it. Right.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. And so it's like, what is it about the groups that we're part of that is so powerful in our ability to spot issues, spot risk, speak up, right? And that's really the point of the book. It's not even like people felt uncomfortable talking because the group is homogeneous. They didn't want to ruffle feathers. They literally didn't see the problem, as this guy's anecdote illustrates. And I find that very consistent with my own experience, that my background as an outsider in certain ways, having access to see the United States from the outside, to see certain groups, from the outside, gives me that like little bit of awareness, that little bit of distance to be able to say like, does anyone else see this issue? Does anyone else see this problem? And that's how I feel like DEI really contributes to company cultures. DEI should not, it's not for the benefit even necessarily of the people who are in the outsider groups. Like, yes, we want, career support or, to make sure that we have a fair shot. It's also really for the benefit of the companies that we are a part of, that the intelligence and life perspective of people from all different walks of life is leveraged, so that the company as a collective is making better decisions.
I think that's a really great explanation. And as someone who is also multi-ethnic, very relatable explanation at the beginning there. Yeah, that hit home for me.
You get it.
I do. So thank you for what you do to advance. When there are companies that are kind of sexy, like Snap is, I think it's helpful that there are people who are seen to be role models in this space, and it sets a tone for other companies as well. So thank you for the work that you do. My final question for you is, what is on the agenda for Snap's compliance program in 2022? So I don't know if you're going to be able to top this kindness evangelism code of conduct, but I'm willing to be surprised.
Yeah, I think it's really some of the elements that I already mentioned, which is, a code of conduct is wonderful. It's it's great. I'll also give a shout out to the company that helped us prepare it, Think Parallax. They're actually in the ESG space.
Oh, interesting.
I love working with them because they were much more aligned with the type of ethics I want to create than someone who had like done a bunch of codes of conduct kind of with a compliance focus. So they really got it. Yeah. Cool. So shout out to them. And they have wonderful graphic designers on their team. And I think for me that it's those two halves of ethics and compliance, the compliance piece and the ethics piece. I'm focused on both of them. In terms of the compliance work, I get great joy out of telling people in the simplest possible terms, making their lives easier. So they have the information they need to follow policies, obey the law. In that realm, I want to be as invisible as possible. I sometimes jokingly refer to that work as I'm a plumber, in the sense that, is pipe A connected to pipe B? Do you have any leaks? Right? Is there any lack of clarity? Do people just need, how can we embed this into workflows to automate this entire process and make it as mindless and easy as possible? I think that's very important work as a company like Snap scales internationally. And then the other part is that sort of kindness evangelism piece, is the ethical culture piece, which I feel is just as important because we're never, I'm never going to be able to possibly think of all the different ways that ethical risk can crop up, compliance risk can crop up. It's emergent. In a company and culture, I can never possibly get ahead of it. And so, to my mind, the best thing I can do is teach people how to think. Is embed the identity of kind business and have it be natural. That it leads people to ask the questions I want them to ask as they are starting to create new products or do new ventures.
Yeah, I think that is the ultimate goal, really, is getting everyone to that point where they're like, my spidey senses are going off. I may not know how to word this exactly as being some kind of a threat to our reputation, but something's not right here, or I feel like this is worth checking. I think if we can get to that point with every single employee, that would be an amazing goal achieved.
Yes. And that they could also activate that other spidey sense where they say, we actually have a social impact here as a company. Let's just take the example of going into an emerging market, right? How can our values, our ethics, our commitment to our stakeholders actually help us be an even more powerful presence in this market in a way that elevates the game for everyone? So it's that sort of thinking where it's not even about mitigating risk necessarily, but it's about like the innovation piece of truly believing that our ethics and the way we approach problems and our relationship with our stakeholders is part of the differentiator, part of what makes us a great company.
Right. That your win-win is a competitive advantage almost.
Yes. Yeah. I think you need all. You need the risk side and you need the possibility side.
Well, I think a lot of people listening will have quite a bit of food for thought to be considering here after today's episode. Nicole, I really appreciate you taking the time to share your philosophy and approach. I love it, especially given that my title is Head of Culture of Integrity. So very much same kinds of thought processes I think are happening. So looking forward to seeing what you do next, and encouraging all of our listeners, take a look at the SNAP Code of Conduct, a really cool resource for seeing what I think is really Codes 3.0 as our profession keeps advancing. Thank you so much, Nicole.
Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Great Women in Compliance. We hope you'll join us in honoring the great women in the compliance field by subscribing to this podcast and leaving a review.